Eisenhower. And also General Powell this is the first time he has done an interview with us. We did televise a speech he gave to a group of students, which was actually, a lot of viewers may remember that. But both Mr. Nitze and Mr. Powell have never joined us before, and we're very pleased to have them on.
Thank you. We're going to start off about 2 hours and 45 minutes of programming, generally looking at defense policy in the Reagan administration, with an interview with Caspar Weinberger, the former Secretary of Defense.
Caspar Weinberger, former Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration. Future years, when you look back on your role in the Reagan administration, the relationship between the Pentagon and the White House, what will your memories be of President Ronald Reagan?
Well, I've known the President for a long time, had the privilege of working with him for a very long time, and most of the memories will be of a warm and compassionate man who was also an extraordinarily good leader, and a man with vision and with the courage to realize and carry out his goals and his objectives, even though he was subjected to strong criticism all the 8 years of his presidency, all the 8 years of his governorship.
He surrounded himself with quite a few friends from California when he came out to Washington to become president. You just referred to your own friendship. Did he really deal with people more on a friendship level than a professional one?
No, I think that he would decide after observation and experience whether he could rely on people and whether he was going to have confidence in them, and then regardless of what state they came from, he would conclude that he would like to have them in his administration, and that he could work well with them. And of course the President could work well with almost everybody. He was a very he's a person who likes people. He likes people to be happy, and he is completely secure and serene and contented himself, and he can charm people very, very quickly, but he can also get people's admiration and enormous support very easily.
A transition of a different kind is going on now, a lot of attention being paid to who will the new president pick for his cabinet. Let's go back 8 years and tell us about that period of time there when you were selected or asked to be the Secretary of Defense, the phone call that you received. How did all that happen?
Well, I don't know what made the President decide that he wanted me to come. I thought I had concluded my government service when I left in 1975 as Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. But the President's a very persuasive man, and I had worked with him in his 1980 campaign and continued to talk with him from time to time. And he apparently concluded that he would like me to be Secretary of Defense. He called and said that he knew that I had had all manner of nice things happen since I had left, and that I had a comfortable and a pleasant and a rich life. And then he said, I want to spoil it all. And it was not possible really to turn down that challenge, because he and I both knew how much we needed to do to rebuild the military, and in what shocking state it had fallen as a result of 10 years, a whole decade of neglect.
Was the phone call a surprise, or had you been thinking about it?
No, I think the President and I had talked after his election more about various budgetary problems and things of that kind, and I had been director of OMB and had been his director of finance when he was governor. But I didn't have any idea what he was going to talk to me about.
Let's talk about some of those, some of what the President said when he campaigned for President in 1980. He campaigned on the idea of a strong defense, the notion of peace through strength, rebuilding the whole Defense Department. Initially, didn't that sound an awful lot like a little more than campaign sloganeering?
No, not when the President talks it. The President doesn't just talk campaign slogans. The President has a way of articulating the worries and the fears and the hopes and the dreams of Americans and people all over the world. And he correctly perceived that our defenses were in terrible state, and that this could erode our ability to deter attacks by others, and that it was a vital priority. I think one of the things he said repeatedly that seems to have been forgotten a bit now was that if it ever came to a choice between rebuilding our military and getting a balanced budget, he would always opt and come down on the side of rebuilding and strengthening the military, because he knew that without that he couldn't accomplish anything that he wanted to.
Now let's talk about how your own feelings on that. In a past life at the Office of Management and Budget and other jobs, you received quite a reputation for your ability to cut into a budget and reduce it, if you will. I think they referred to you at a time as cap the knife. And then you go from that sort of a reputation into starting to basically oversee the largest peacetime defense buildup we've seen. Was that a little difficult to make the jump?
I think in the Office of Management and Budget, and still, we have a great deal to do to reduce domestic spending, and a great deal can be done to reduce it if we could only get the political courage to do that on the part of the Congress, the kind of political courage that the President had to increase defense spending. Not a popular move in a democracy. People don't like to spend money on defense, but you have to do things that the situation requires, and you have to recognize that unless the country is strong and secure and can stay that way, none of these other things can be accomplished. The very best social program of all is one that gives people peace and freedom.
Can you accomplish both at the same time?
Yes, I think you can. Bear in mind that when people talk about reductions in domestic spending that would be necessary to balance the budget, we aren't talking about cutting out Social Security or anything like that kind of nonsense. What we're talking about in many of the domestic programs is reducing the rate of increase. Bear in mind that during the 5-year period from 1982 to 1987, really 6 years, counting both years, Congress decreased and cut back the President's defense requests by $125 billion. But the Congress increased his domestic requests by over $250 billion. And that, of course, is where your deficit comes from. And that those were increases that Congress made after the President had recognized and requested some inflation-required increases. So that there was an enormous increase in domestic spending. There had to be an increase in defense spending, and there was. But defense spending is not the villain or the cause of the deficit by any means.
Let's talk about your role in selling the defense buildup to Congress. You were up on Capitol Hill a great deal, appearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee and the House side as well. Can you tell us a little bit about the strategy? Looking back to January, February 1981, how did you go about selling that?
What we had to do was, of course, and it's a very difficult task in a democracy because democratic, liberal, freedom-loving people just don't like to spend money on defense. I guess I'm the leading authority on that subject. But we had to do it, and we've never been able to sustain a defense buildup in peacetime for more than a few months, 18, 21 months. We did it for 5.5 years under President Reagan. We had to do it. And we did regain immense military strength during that period. But what you have to do, I think, is try to persuade the Congress and of course, talk with the people as frequently as you can, and that's why I did so much more television and radio than I really wanted to do. You have to persuade the people that you need to base your defense budget not on what's fair to domestic spending or not on whether it's equal cuts from highways and harbor dredging and so on. You have to base your defense budget on things outside the control of the country, on the nature of the threat that comes from other countries. And when you look at the Soviet military capability, see how it increases, see how easy it is for them to vote increases because they don't have any votes. There's 3 or 4 people in the Kremlin decide it, and they don't have any public opinion, they don't have any discussion, they don't have any commentators or anybody criticizing them. And as a result, they have a system which we don't want to emulate, not for a moment, but which gives them an enormous military advantage because they can decide, not just for 1 year, but for 4 or 5 years, how much they're going to spend, and that it will be an increase. And we have to persuade and quite properly get the votes for the increases that we make. We can't do it ever for more than just kind of a month-to-month sort of process. The Soviet military leaders, their Minister of Defense knows 4 or 5 years in advance how much they'll be spending and that it will be an increasing amount. I was lucky if I knew 2 weeks ahead of time because frequently our budgets were not passed on time and there were reductions made. But by and large, in the first 4 years, almost the first 5 years, Congress supported and the people supported very large defense increases. The problem was, of course, that nobody liked to do that, and as we regained enormous military strength, more and more people began to say, well, now you finished the job. That's enough. You've succeeded. We don't need any more. Sadly, the Soviets don't follow that kind of policy, and sadly, they keep adding and are still adding to their military capability at an enormous rate.
But is the job over? Once you get a defense project going, it's not as if you can stop it right then. It takes many years to complete, so it isn't necessarily stopped now. It continues on and on.
Yes, there's a lot in the pipeline now, and the carriers, for example, take 6, 7 years to build. But when the Congress authorized us to build 2 carriers at once, in effect giving us that we knew we'd have to get sometime, rather than doing one year and one 5 years down the road, when they authorized 2 at once, we were able to get savings of close to $3 billion, simply because we knew that we had that authorization, and we could assemble and keep the necessary skilled labor force. We could get all of the components and pieces and parts manufactured ahead of time, and that's the way to do it. But unfortunately, we've not been able to persuade the Congress that we should have 2- and 3-year budgets.
You said a few minutes ago you had to do more TV and radio than you really wanted in those early years, suggesting some sort of a strategy to accomplish what you want. How is the strategy developed, and tell us a little bit more about it.
Well, it simply was a recognition that military spending is unpopular, that military spending was absolutely vital, and that you had to take the case to the people. Frequently, you would find people who write about these things, or people who'd even write about the hearings, or that would necessarily, and I don't say it critically at all, have a view that was in effect opposed to military spending. And consequently, in order to get the case to the people, it seemed to me essential that they hear it and make up their own minds directly from the people who were most concerned with it. Would be the Secretary of Defense. And we tried to do that, and I think it was essential to do that, because otherwise everything you said comes through a sort of a filter of the person who writes about it. But if you are talking to people yourself, for good or for bad, for better or for worse, why, they can make up their own minds.
But were you using television so that you would let people know, so that they in turn would write the congressman who perhaps was opposing you on defense spending?
The whole theory of our system of government is that when the people want something, they would be able to secure it by advice and persuasion of their own congressman. That doesn't always work, because frequently you'll find polls that show that a large majority of the people want something like strategic defense, but you'll find Congress continually opposing it.
The President, what were your conversations like with the President during all this, and what was his role? What role did he play in convincing Congress to go along with what you were presenting?
He is the greatest persuader of all, and it was, without any question, his leadership that secured the appropriations and the positive action on as much of his program as we could get. There were, as I said, cuts made in it, $125 billion cut off his requests over those years. But because he had been so successful with his economic policies in getting inflation down, we were able to make the sums that were appropriated go much farther than we felt and had thought we could.
When people look back at the Reagan administration, they think of defense, do you think that's the one part of the Defense Department or his feelings on defense that they'll remember the most?
No, I think the thing that will be remembered the most is really his greatest accomplishment, and that's the complete turnaround in the morale, in the spirit, in the performance of the American military forces. When we came in 1980 and 81, my confirmation hearings at that time, all of the questions were not whether we would have to have a draft again, but when. Because we were not filling the available spaces. People were leaving the military in droves. People who had sometimes 3 or 4 years, field and company grade officers and enlisted men, and non-commissioned officers. And we had to do something very quickly or give up the volunteer system. And what was done was a change in attitude by the American people, and particularly their government, toward the military. The military had not been, I think, well treated or well respected by the Carter administration. The President reversed all of that, and by calls at the various posts and visits, which I also tried to do, conveyed correctly to the American fighting men and women that their country and their government had great admiration and respect and appreciation for them. And we also were able to do some practical things in the way of salary increases and benefit increases that had been long neglected and were really disgracefully low when we took office.
U.S. soldiers were called upon several times during the Reagan administration to move into very difficult situations, some resulting in deaths of U.S. soldiers. Let's talk about some of those and, in hindsight, whether or not it was a good idea. And the first one that comes to mind is sending the Marines into Beirut. In hindsight, was that a good idea?
Well, when they went in as part of an international force with a very limited and well-defined mission. And it was perfectly justified to do that. We joined with forces from Italy and France and England, and the purpose was to, first of all, to prevent terrible house-to-house fighting of the most bloody kind in the city of Beirut, and to disarm the PLO and get the PLO organizations out of Lebanon, and that was accomplished, and then we withdrew. The second time we went in was also with a limited, narrow, well-defined mission that we were sized to accomplish, and that was to insert a peacekeeping international force, again, we were one of the parts of that, between the withdrawing Syrian and Israeli armies. Unfortunately, those agreements of withdrawal were not signed by both sides. The Israelis signed, the Syrians did not. So there weren't any troops withdrawing for this force to be inserted, but and to give the withdrawing forces confidence that it would be carried out. That mission, therefore, became impossible because they went in to stand between withdrawing armies and the armies weren't withdrawing. It was the full recognition of the impossibility of that led the President correctly to say that we should no longer be part of that mission. But unfortunately, terrorists had done terrible damage in that in the tragic bombing of the Marine barracks before that took place.
The bombing of that Marine barracks. Tell us about the conversations you had with the President.
Well,
overall.
we were all horrified by that, of course. It was the ultimate terrorist act, and we all know that you cannot guarantee that if somebody straps a load of dynamite to their chest and walks into a room and explodes it and kills themselves, that there's no way that you can really prevent that happening. You can take a lot of precautions. In the Beirut case, a truck loaded with high explosives was literally driven up the steps of the barracks, and everybody in the truck, all the terrorists were killed, but the horrible loss of life among our Marines. And we were all obviously very terribly stricken by this tragic thing.
Did the President call members of his cabinet and say, "This is what I want to do, I've already decided," or did he call you up and say, "Secretary, what do you think we ought to do with this?"
No, we had discussions, not in the cabinet, but in the National Security Council, and after very thorough discussions in which some people didn't want to withdraw, the President concluded that the mission could not be accomplished by a battalion of Marines as part of an international force when the thing they went to do, to stand between withdrawing armies, was clearly not possible because the armies weren't going to withdraw, and a battalion of Marines, good as they are, can't compete with 50,000 Syrians or whatever. So, of course, the decision was very clear. It was not a retreat or anything of that kind. It was simply an acknowledgement that the things that the international force had gone in to do could not be accomplished.
When the President called those meetings or sat down and talked about things like that, was it a setting where you discussed it and then whatever the majority of the people around the table, that's how they do it?
The President makes up his own mind. He likes to have advice. He likes to hear conflicting views presented to him, but he makes his own decisions.
Libya, flying in, and the bombing raid in Libya. Tell us about that and the decisions that went into that, and also a little bit more your role with the President in planning that.
Well, when the proof came in that the Libyan government had, and Gaddafi in particular, had in effect perpetrated the killing and wounding of servicemen and women in Berlin in a cafeteria or disco or whatever there, then it became quite apparent that we should, as was always been our policy, to make retaliatory actions that would convince the people who carried out the terrorism, the Libyan government, that they'd have to pay a terrible price for having done that, and they should never do it again. And the problem is always to get your proof. When we had the proof, then we formulated the plans and had a focused response by attacking the places where these terrorists were trained, where they did their flying from, where they did a lot of their planning, their headquarters. All of these were picked out as suitable targets. The President was very anxious that we not do any collateral damage. That's a nice way of saying that people who had nothing to do with the terrorist act shouldn't be killed too. And so our response was focused and I think extraordinarily successful. It, practically speaking, drove Gaddafi out of business for many, many months. You never even heard of him. He slept at a different place every night for months and months after that. Never would make a public speech or public gathering, and his participation in terrorist acts ceased for a long time. I have no idea whether they're over permanently, but the action was a total and complete success, and it demonstrated the readiness and the capability of our forces.
Was that the idea, just basically unnerve Muammar Gaddafi?
No, it was to demonstrate that there was a terrible cost. That if he wanted to practice terrorism, if he wanted to export terrorism and kill American servicemen and women through terrorist acts, then he was going to have to pay a price that he would find too high. And that indeed is what we did.
Tell us about actually how it was carried out. You know, a meeting is held, you come up with your options,
planning,
and you decide how it goes from the president to you all the way down to the fighter
yes,
pilot?
once the decision is made, why then the execution of that plan, the execution of the president's decision, rests with the Defense Department. And for an action of that kind, a great deal of planning went into it. There are over 100 planes in the air, counting all of the reconnaissance and the planes to destroy the Libyan radar ahead of time and the search and rescue missions in case we needed them. All of this required immense planning and coordination, and we obviously kept in close touch with the President as these plans were developed to carry out his basic decision.
Did you always have several different ways of doing it, several different plans?
Well, you try to cover all contingencies and plan for things that can go wrong as well as things that can go right. Combat is a very untidy process, and things can go wrong, and you want to try to anticipate as many of those as you can. Terrorism
was a hot topic in the last 8 years. Was this the Defense Department's, the administration's greatest success?
Well, it was one of the things that we did that we felt we had to do, and one of the things that we accomplished completely, and it certainly was, I think, a very great success. So were a number of other things.
Grenada, invasion of Grenada. What was the President's role in that?
Well, the President's role was decisive. He is the man who decided that we had to respond favorably to the invitation of the members of the Eastern Caribbean nations, that we also had to rescue over 1,000 Americans whom we correctly felt were in great peril and could become hostages or could be killed. And he made that basic decision, and very shortly thereafter, again showing the capability and the readiness of our forces, we were able to launch a completely successful operation that accomplished all of its missions. It's always rather amusing in a sardonic sort of way to read what a terrible failure Grenada was because one man's radio didn't work or something of that kind. What happened was that we did rescue 1,000 Americans who were in a very great perilous situation, and we restored a democratic government to a complete anarchy that was in existence in Grenada before, and we eliminated it as a potential Cuban or Soviet base. And there were a great many Cuban and Soviet supplies and workers there trying to turn it into that. So in every measure that you possibly could have, Grenada was a total success.
When President Reagan came to office, a lot was being written about the U.S. military's ineptness at taking action overseas with the terrorism and whatnot, the helicopters crashing in the desert trying to rescue Americans held hostage in Iran. Whereas some of these events that we've just talked about, Beirut, Grenada, Libya, and others, an attempt on the part of the President and the Pentagon to change this image and perhaps show that the American forces can go overseas and
No, we wanted obviously to have American forces ready to carry out any of the President's foreign policy objectives or anything that we had to do. But none of them were done as gestures or any kind of demonstrations. They were done, and we only used the military as a last resort and with considerable reluctance. But we did it when we had to, and the fact that we were able to do it successfully and in a way with very little planning in Grenada's case that demonstrated we were ready, and that's a source of great pride.
Looking back at the Pentagon while you were there in the Reagan administration, a lot was written about disagreements between the Pentagon and the State Department, yourself and Secretary of State George Shultz. What can you tell us about that?
Well, there are institutional differences between the departments always, with the diplomatic function and the military function. Sometimes the differences reverse themselves, and that it was the Pentagon that was more anxious to only be used as a last resort, and only after all other means that failed, and sometimes the State Department wanted to make demonstrations of American strength by dispatching American forces. I was very much influenced in all of those decisions by my feeling that we'd made a terrible, terrible mistake in Vietnam that I didn't want ever to be repeated, and that was entering a war and asking men and women to commit their lives to a cause that we did not intend to win. And I always took the position that we could not send our forces into combat or into any kind of action unless we intended to win, and sent them in with sufficient support and resolution and will to win. That we must never again repeat Vietnam. And this produced some differences, but there were a lot of agreements too.
How did the President handle two members of his cabinet, very important members, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, disagreeing on very key fundamental issues like this?
I think the President wanted to have people state their views honestly and clearly, and he would then make up his mind. And I don't think it hurts to have differing views expressed. What's needed is a decisive leader such as the President who can make up his mind and either take parts of both arguments or go with one or the other. He has to have some clear objectives in his own mind to do that. But I think he's aided by having people who give their own honest advice, if he has confidence in the people, and then he makes up his own mind. It's inevitable there are going to be differences. But that's really the whole purpose of the cabinet system.
When you did that, would everybody sit around the table and the President would just say, okay, here it is, what are we going to do with it? And everybody would just sort of mix it up?
Well, no, it wasn't quite that informal, but there were a number of papers prepared for issues that were to be discussed, and the President was familiar with the issues. He listened to the arguments. Frequently he would take them under advisement, so to speak, and make his decisions later times. But basically and it was true